camera's on the table, and it's filming just now.
Is this a mic?
So
There's a mic, yeah.
they don't see us, we can.
Perfect. Okay. Whenever you're ready, my phone will do the time.
The problem in a lot of sports leagues internationally is that certain teams structurally make more money, and it creates uncompetitive leagues that are less enjoyable to watch and in the end become less popular, going against the fundamental reason why sports leagues exist. That said, I think our model is fairly clear. Generally, normatively, we think it is better to tax teams so that essentially you remove the outliers. We are not going to require that every team has the exact same income, but we are going to meaningfully redistribute funds such that there are not outliers on either side. People are generally clustered around a mean of a similar amount of money and a similar amount of profit. That said, I think there are kind of three levels to talk about today. First, how do teams make money? Generally, there are four ways that teams earn money. First, ticket sales. Second, media and advertising using players or the team's image. Third, television contracts with television companies, also radio. And fourth, merchandising. So we think with that general knowledge of how teams are funded, we think the first question becomes, what are the obligations of the league? We think there are a few positive obligations that they have. Yes.
So there are some leagues which are profoundly huge, like in England with football,
right.
which you sort of segregate them by the levels which they compete, or you sort of redistribute income across the entire playing field.
Right, so I think it depends somewhat on the sports you have. Some sports have distinctly separate leagues, in which case they would be redistributed on each separate league. So for example, American baseball has multiple divisions. Each division would be separately redistributed. We're not redistributing from the lowest farm league all the way up to the highest league, but within the same level of competitiveness, we would be redistributing. That said, obligations of the league. We think the most fundamental obligation of a league is to the entertainment and the popularity of their league. Within that, we think the reason why this exists is because the larger organization, they have an obligation to the teams within it. Fundamentally, most teams would be unable to exist without the larger league because the league does things like negotiates television contracts with national or international broadcasters. At that point, we think it becomes clear that the obligations of the league is to ensure that all of the subsidiary teams within it are successful and are able to function. We think there are two main ways that you allow teams to function. First, you have a good geographic spread of teams. Essentially, within the area that you operate, you have teams all throughout. The reason why this is important is because generally people end up supporting sports teams that are from their local area or that they have a connection to. When there isn't any team in your geographic area, it decreases the interest in that sport and their interest in following it. So at that point, I think that's an obligation of the league. Secondly, we think there's an obligation of the league to increase the competitive success of all teams. Because understand, if one team is very competitive, they don't just get all the fans. What ends up happening is less people are interested in that team, and you end up with large areas that don't have any support. So therefore, we think the two things you ought to adjudicate this round on are a wide variety of teams throughout the area and teams that are of similar competitive success, because that's how you lead to the longest longevity of the league, which is their primary obligation. What are things that we don't think the league has an obligation to? Fundamentally, we do not believe that teams have a right to retain their profits for three unique reasons. First, because we think they rely on the league for their existence. To the extent that they could not exist without a larger league, that no one would just watch the one individual football team not playing anyone else, we think that it becomes true that their profits come from the fact that the league exists, and therefore the league has the unique right to redistribute. Second, we think that they compete against other teams within that league, right? The teams that are the most profitable tend to be teams that have rivalries with other teams. Therefore, they derive their profit from other teams existing, and therefore we think that can be distributed to those other teams. Third, we tell you they compete with other sports. In countries that have multiple popular sports, there ends up being competition between those. So you have an obligation to make your league the most competitive so it comparatively does better. At that point, we think you have an obligation to the league, not to an individual team's profit. That said, two things to look at. First, how do we make good teams better? Second, how do we make bad teams better? So for teams that are already good in the status quo, I think redistributing profit actually makes them better for two reasons. First, because nobody likes foregone conclusions, right? Teams that have a lot of profit and that win repeatedly, in the end, people tend to turn against them, tend to find them less interesting. For example, after you win the Super Bowl many, many times, your profits end up dropping because people like the underdog, people like the team that they are less used to. But secondly, we tell you that good teams are incentivized to train players better, because many sports have essentially farm league systems where players work up within them. The problem is, in the status quo, very popular teams just buy good players and don't train their lower players, using those few stars to get attention. At that point, you create a system where players throughout the league are systemically worse at the sport. We think you train players to be better and to make your sport better when you actually have to work at it because you don't have an absurdly imbalanced budget. The second thing that I want to talk about is how you make bad teams better. I think this is the way the government today's round very clearly wins, right? Because most teams aren't the ones that have so-called hegemony within the sport. What happens to these teams? Three things. First, we think that in the status quo, these profits buy you not just players, but also things like stadiums, which make more people willing to watch you because you have more compelling television or compelling radio to watch. Yes?
What's the incentive to sign up for a bunch of different contracts and invest effort in that when you're having to share the profits with several other teams?
Individual teams do not do things like television contracts, the league does overall, but we also think there's always an incentive to comparatively make profit, because the reason you're making profit is because you have fans, so you still want to get the fans even if you're not getting the profit, so you still have the incentive. But secondly, we tell you that it helps bad teams because it helps the underdog. Essentially, once they win once, you end up being able to expand coverage and expand your market share, meaning that you geographically spread out the teams that are good. But the third thing we want to talk about is we also think that internationally you spread into other countries, because in teams outside of Britain or the United States that have less centralized sports leagues, you often have inter-country leagues, where there are leagues across, for example, larger parts of Africa. In that case, we think when you actively share profits between teams, it makes it easier to start up new teams in countries that currently don't have the profit base to be able to start that team because you are sharing the profit, which means in the long term, you expand the geographic reach of your league and make it more popular internationally. In the end, the status quo is a system where the best teams stay good and the worst teams don't get better. That is not a sports league that people are incentivized to watch. In the end, the only way you achieve the two burdens we set at the top of a geographic spread and an increase in competitiveness is when all teams start on an equal playing field with relatively equal money. All these reasons strongly urge government to vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, just the gentleman with the beard. You're helping with the streaming?
Yes.
Perfect. Just, guys, obviously you might need to move in and out. If you could just do so between speeches, that would be really helpful. Just because if the speaker's speaking, it can be a bit distracting if someone's walking.
Yeah, sorry.
That's completely fine. No worries. Okay, without further ado, thank you very much for the speech. Call upon the Leader of the Opposition here.
Laughable to say at a competition like this, where we're all very excited to see a few exceptional debaters and exceptional teams, that everyone should be roughly the same and we'll all get maybe 65s or 70s and it'll all be fine, right? That'll be something fun to watch, and that individuals who then see this video on YouTube will be really excited that it was put there. I think what we're considering on our side of the house is that to win this round, we're going to prove to you that it's in the interest of the sport as a whole, and perhaps the domestic a group of fans as a whole, to have a concentration of wealth and thus talent on particular teams. We're also going to explain to you that a lot of the moral justifications I try to give you on our side of the house essentially make no sense. We're talking about cases where there's individual efforts to raise money, there's individual merit that gets that money, and that money should be concentrated where it's earned. So let me give you a few of those arguments before going into refutation. So let's talk about where funds come from. So I think we heard this idea that the league does all the work, and that's first of all not true in a lot of cases. For example, when there was a very wealthy Malaysian who purchased Cardiff's team, right, they did this so that they could invest in that particular team. Some teams do raise money in and of themselves, by themselves, and that's money that they should have as their own. Why? Because it comes with certain restrictions. We're going to replace your coach. We're going to do X, Y thing such that you are going to be a better team. If an individual cannot get that benefit from investing money in that team or buying that team, they're not going to do it. So that's just less money in the league overall. But more importantly, I think they made a good comment when they said sports compete with other sports. If all of your teams are equally mediocre, no TV wants to touch you, let alone give you a contract worth a lot of money. At the best case, you'll get a contract that's worth less money. Whereas if you have one or two must-see teams that everyone is crazy about, that's when you get to hike up the price on TV contracts. What are the results on their side of the house? You're literally getting leagues that simply have less money floating around. So that means overall things like coaching, stadiums, etc. is worse. That also means you lose fans. Ooh, that means you spiral down such that things get even worse, there's less money and fewer fans, and you essentially just destroy the league. I think we can't underestimate the harm of that impact when a lot of sports are literally built on getting one fabulous coach that costs an insane amount of money. Those are things you cannot do on their side of the house because you've equalized things to the point where they don't exist. We'd furthermore say that there's a lot of benefit in a country where you can actually concentrate that wealth on one or two people. So think about Portugal. A lot of the teams aren't that great, but they're all equally good. No one cares about any of those teams, right? If they were able to, say, take Porto's team and invest huge amounts of money in them, there's unique things that they do that elevate that team, elevate that country's pride in that sport, and deliver all of the benefits I know we all agree are inherent in sport. What are those things that they deliver? First of all, they're able to do a lot more in terms of their academy and outreach. We see things like the Yankees in New York, right, which get players from Cuba. That costs mad money, but they're able to do it because they have it, and they wouldn't be able to if everyone was spreading out that money and trying to have the same effort at the same time. Two, they do a lot of wild things to just get fans, which get that merchandise and get all that support, right? Like they go to China for tours, right? When the Lakers do that, that's obviously a huge bet that they take for money, but it's something, again, that they can afford to do. Third of all, they're also able to pump a lot of money into salaries. So that means instead of everyone having one good player, like playing with a bunch of losers like me on a team who are with them because they don't cost much, you get a lot of good players on one team that together are worth more than the sum of their parts, and thus make a better team than you could have ever had, better playing than you would have ever seen. Those are things you only get on our side of the house. And lastly, we'd say that they're actually able to get more access to capital as a team, and they're able to do some of these riskier things, so then it creates this follow-on effect that you'd not have seen. All of these things together mean that the sport does better. Fans are more excited about games, right? And this is something that I think we miss on their side of the house because we've heard nothing about how you can actually augment the total amount of talent, excitement, pride, and funds in that sport. Go.
Given that the truly excellent players exist on either side of the house, aren't those players inherently always going to go to some team and therefore always create good teams? They just won't be paying outsized salaries that they currently
So
pay.
one, they're not going to have as much investment in their talent within one team that can afford all the best coaching, all of the best equipment, take care of all their personal issues, which then makes them better. But two, they're not also playing with a whole bunch of other great players that make them better on the court. Try playing basketball with one great player and a whole bunch of duds. It's not going to go very well. I think all these things help make that point. I think they're things I actually already said. Okay, what did we hear on their side of the house? So they gave you a lot of sources of money. I gave you other sources of money, and they basically said, look, this is all the league. Okay, the league is also nothing without its players. Insofar as all the teams benefit from this base value of being in the league, presuming that the league was totally attributable for all their benefits, they'd already be equal. It's clear that the teams are doing individual things that help them to get money. Some of these things incur great responsibilities, like as I said, if a team is bought and then agrees to a whole bunch of things, which are things that they deserve to get. But second of all, sometimes they just manage their money better, they manage their talent better, they get better coaches. We don't think teams that squander funds and don't manage to make anything of themselves deserve to just have more money pumped in as though that solves the problem. I think by disregarding all management issues and focusing only on funding issues, they miss the point of what makes a good team and what doesn't make a good team. But furthermore, right, I think when we're talking about, who gets the viewership or whatever just because they're in the league, again, it might be one particular team that gets the contract for everyone else because of their talent, because of their management. So in that case, we'd say that they do deserve whatever disproportionate gains that they get. Recognize also, I think that they exaggerate the harms that we see in lesser teams because they do get that trickle-down benefit if, say, there's a TV contract that they somehow get into, right? I think if there's more excitement about the sport overall, they're going to get trickle-down in terms of ticket sales or maybe some memorabilia or maybe some fans supporting them because, look, this sport is now popular. Now as someone in XYZ city, I guess I'll support my local team. They are benefiting to some degree already by being in a league with a successful team. So we don't think that it's even fair on their side of the house to suggest that things are so inherently unequal or that there's no right at all. Furthermore, they talk about the idea of a local team and why you want your local team uniquely to win. I'd say that this is flawed for a few reasons. In a lot of sports, for example in North America, where you can only have so many cities in a league, people will literally buy a team from another city and make that their city. And it's not like the original city just forgets about the sport and stops watching it. People will actually watch teams from other countries sometimes, right? So it's not totally implausible that you'd like something else. But what we do think is crucial is that most people want some sort of domestic team. I think that's a reasonable understanding or interpretation of their argument. And that's something that when I gave you the Portugal example, I think I'll already explain falls on our side of the house. If you want any sort of talent that's even remotely related to you, that's able to participate in very large international competitions, represent you on a global level, that's something you only get with a concentration of talent and wealth. And so in that way, if you really want people to have pride, I don't think a bunch of mediocre teams, but one that's just for you, is really going to solve that problem. We think a team that's maybe from your country but does well is actually going to be better. Lastly, we talked about a lot how the league essentially gets boring, right? You're not going to have an underdog, and that's not very exciting. So again, if they're all mediocre, I don't think that's exciting. I think people like innovation within the top few teams insofar as they're great and they're breaking boundaries. I think that's something that's also exciting in sport. They've never justified to you why it is that a bunch of teams that aren't that great or exciting are also good. And lastly, they said that you're going to have essentially more training in players, more investment. Again, I think you only get some of the best innovations if you can concentrate things in one place. That's something I've also said. But recognize that teams are already good, are still investing in training, are still doing all these things. These benefits still maintained on our side of the house. For these reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose. Make sure the good teams stay good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the Deputy Prime Minister. Here. If you could not cross the floor during speeches, that would be awesome. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Everybody ready? I really enjoy it when European individuals come up here and lecture us about how American basketball or American baseball works. Because I think the notion that the Yankees somehow are motivating other people to watch the Major League Baseball League in the United States because they've won the last 10 world championships, except for this one because the Chicago Cubs won, necessarily is just insane. The amount of viewership that dropped in the United States when watching baseball after the Yankees won consecutively for a decade was they lost over half their viewership. We think this is incredibly problematic, and we think the notion of when you have teams that have the consolidation power that the New York Yankees do in the United States is why people choose to stop watching leagues. And in fact, we think the examples they give with Portugal are equally underrepresented. We think necessarily because many people in Portugal chose to start watching either Spanish teams, Italian teams, or other European teams because, again, there was a consolidation of power simply indicates the problem. In this speech, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to talk about why some teams make more money, and I'm just going to reject the notion that those teams are uniquely better or somehow better deserving. Second, I'm going to talk about why it then means that we get better sports across the board, even if you reject the burden that Zoe gave you, that we didn't actually hear any good warranted rejection from out of OO. And then I'm finally going to talk about how teams spend money and what happens to teams when they go under. I'm going to refute throughout. But the first thing I want to talk about is why teams make more money than some of them. The arguments we hear out of OO are specifically that necessarily funds come from a couple different places. Maybe you can raise money by selling ownership, which is not profit-seeking, but rather a short infusion of capital. But secondarily, they tell us it's because they have a bunch of good players. Here's the problem. They've now gotten to the cycle of chicken and the egg. Do the players come first? Do the profits come first? We would posit that necessarily the profits come first, not because the players were there, but rather because certain areas have better distribution. This is what Zoe talks about when she talks about the development, but is never actually meaningfully responded to. We would say some teams are in more densely populated urban areas. That's why in the United States, Los Angeles has multiple sports teams within the same league, as well as the fact that New York City has this, but Arizona only has one league that is one team that is very low in profits because there aren't a lot of people living in Arizona in the United States. But secondly, we would say these areas also have large disposable incomes. That is why places like London or Seattle, though they are not as populated as New York City, often see the similar profits because they have large disposable incomes in these areas. This means it is the areas that were most privileged and best off in the first place that actually get these good teams, not because they have good players. We think that this then creates a cycle where even if we were to accept that teams that have good players should deserve their profits, we actually never get there because those teams are never given the chance to show that they have the best players or that they have the best coaches. So we reject on face what they are telling us. But necessarily we would say we want more areas to have more profits. Why is this the case? We would say when you're trying to push into other cities, other international markets, other countries, it is most important to get those individuals who have the most dedication to sports. These tend to be people with the least amount of disposable income, those individuals who are looking for some escapism from their situation within life. We think those individuals, if you necessarily get them attached to sports, in love with a team when they get disposable income either in this generation or the next, this becomes the most likely for them to spend it on. Now sports is not just competing between football and basketball, between the American market and the European market, but actually sports is competing with doing things like buying nicer shoes or buying nicer food. We think this is incredibly important and not only develops the league, but ensures that you have even larger markets into the future. We think that's why it is important, given how teams make money, why we necessarily need profit sharing, because that's the only way those markets ever open up. Because in the status quo, people aren't going to spend their money on sports. What's up?
Even if it was totally arbitrary which team it was in Portugal that actually became good, is it not an obvious benefit that at least one of their teams is now good?
Yes, but the team only ever gets good if you have the money in the first place to buy better players, to buy better equipment, to buy better coaches, to do that in the first place, because people aren't going to show up as a sports fan or sports base before the players are there, is to have profit sharing. We would say that makes things better. Moreover, we would say the best sports are that is which is most competitive. I think this is the analogy that we get from OO, necessarily about this notion of debaters being some sort of sports league, and if we're a sports league, God, we are pathetic. But more importantly, I think it is necessary to recognize that we are the best league when we have the most competitive top. The years the most people who don't attend Worlds tune into the live streams for the out rounds are the ones in which they want to see the most amount of people. We would then say, despite this notion of mediocre teams, if you have a bunch of teams that are evenly matched and interesting to watch, that actually does increase the league. Because as Zoe points out and is never refuted, if you live in a city that has no sports base, you aren't going to suddenly become another city's sports fan without a major introduction. We think that introduction that sucks people in is incredibly important. But the final thing I want to talk about is how do we get teams spending money, and how do we ensure that when teams are failing, we solve them the best? Couple of different things. First, I want to break this down into two different categories. I think there are two different types of sports writ large. I think there are the first type of sports in which you need one or two very good players, and managerial positions as well as like statistical positions are incredibly important. This is things like European football, like basketball in the United States. We would say in these situations, even when you have equal profits across the board, this doesn't mean that everybody buys mediocre players. We think this then incentivizes clearer strategy around a single player. This is actually really good rather than having all of the good players on one team like the Lakers. We would say this allows for more cults of personality, which are good because they increase the sales around those individuals. It also ensures that coaches and strategies play a larger role in these sports, meaning they become more interesting to watch. You get to see a more variety of different things happening, and it actually sucks people in to not only just watching the game, but the gameplay itself. Secondly, we would then say that there's a different type of sport where you have a lot of players on your team. This is like American baseball or American football. We would say in these areas, it's not that they're squandering their funds or that they want to only have one good team. We would say that those individuals are most likely to do things like benefit from having across the board the same equipment and rather showing off the talent of the whole team. We would then say when these places have teams where they have failing, we would say the money helps because in the short term, they often do things like go into debt to try and buy teams down the line so they're buying a bunch of rookie players. We would say that actually increase of loss means those teams are more likely to lose. In our world, we're less likely to have to sell off teams and rebuild sports bases. As a Seattle Sonics fan, when they left Seattle, I simply no longer followed basketball. We think that's what happens. It means you have less profits across the board.
Thank you very much. And now the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
This opening government say they want to focus on competitive balance and geographical spread. I'll talk about those two things. But before that, I just want to point out, I think the arguments from opening government that say the sources of this inequality financially are illegitimate and historical, I think fall out of this debate. Because our point is the burden we've taken up in opening opposition, it's not about arguing which sources of historical legitimacy are good or bad. We've argued very clearly that agglomeration in sport of resources is good. It's good for the spread of the sport, it's good for signing bigger contracts that trickle down resources to smaller clubs, it's good for the viability of the sport as a whole. So I think as long as we show you that allowing some clubs to have perhaps a bulk of resources, but given that they have the incentives to use this in the right ways, that's an acceptable way for us to deal with this argument. Let's start with competitive balance. The first thing I want to point out here is that while it's admirable to create some sort of equality, the argument from opening government as to why this is a good thing is an instrumental one. That is to say, the instrumental justification for why balance is good is that it increases viewership. So I think they failed two links. The first link is that they've never actually proven why money actually ties to tangible outcomes in sport. As much as I, as a Yankees fan, would love to acknowledge the fact that they've won the last 10 championships, that's a lie. They haven't done so despite having the largest payroll for probably most of those 10 years. I think they've not given us an actual reason as to why money is definitive in the way our outcomes come about. To the extent that it isn't, very often there is still room for you to reward, no thank you, good management and good signing of players and good statistical management. So I think it's not clear at all why money tangibly creates a determined outcome in sport. But the second thing I would suggest is that outcomes aren't tied to viewership either. That is to say that they've not shown us why the fact that one team has never won the Premier League for the last 20 years, say Sunderland or Newcastle, has, I suspect, maybe not drastically reduced people who show up on game day in the colours of red and white or the colours of black and white with their family to cheer on this team. Just because they haven't won the Premier League, most teams haven't, right, in the last 20 years. I don't think that's meant that viewership's gone down. So at least locally, your reasons for supporting a club, as they've acknowledged, are often not tied to the success of that club. It's often tied to things like geography, things like history, things like family relations, neither of which would change. It is not clear, no thank you, why a competitive balance in opening government would increase viewership amongst the people who they claim are losing support. What does Debi tell you? She tells you that the viewership you need to care about are people not currently interested. How do you get them interested? The point is you bring together the best players, the biggest resources to create international global market brands and to allow these one or two teams, no thank you, to take on amounts of risk that they wouldn't otherwise have done, like the Yankees. Sure, the Yankees have a lot of money, but that also makes it a lot easier for them to take risks in, say, signing players from Cuba or signing players from less known countries in order to grow the sport in those countries. Sure, they benefit if these players turn out well, but that's something they're in a better position to do the more resources they have. Crucially, I think she tells you two more things. The way we create global viewership is number one, by giving one or two, not every team's going to get this, the resources to embark on branding and marketing programs, like playing random games in China that might not pay off in the first 5 years, but expand the sport to these players and get them to buy into your sport as it's emerging, like with basketball. Thank you. Number two, the collection of star players that they frown upon is very often what gets people passionate about your sport in the first place. The reason I entered the sport, following basketball or baseball, was precisely being attracted to these teams of bandwagon teams like the Lakers or the Yankees. And the reason I do this is because those are the teams which bring together the names I'm most likely to have heard of, to have seen on the internet, or like I've heard of in commercials. Why then is it important that these huge teams are entry points? Because they get you interested in the sport in the very first place. What is the impact of this? The impact I think they've not dealt with is that it makes the very contracts you want to sign bigger. Opening government are right when they point out that signing contracts is done on a league-wide basis. Yes, so if I've never been interested in football, no thank you, and I'm from Singapore, right? Note, not European. Neither of us are European actually, Canadian, Singaporean. Get the facts right. But I'm far more likely to be interested in the Premier League as a league if the entry point for me is, say, a club like Arsenal or a club like Manchester United. Having identified with these players and oh wow, this is a glamorous club, something that my family is cared about because of these superstar players, I'm more likely to care. When I'm more likely to care, I'm more likely to purchase, for instance, things like a league pass, like TV license. No, thank you. And it is people like me purchasing these TV licenses that create the large multi-million-dollar contracts that share revenue in a way that would not otherwise have existed for clubs like Sunderland and Newcastle. Because let's be honest, most of us halfway around the world wouldn't care about these places. But we do have an incentive to care when they're the team that my favorite team is playing against. So you bring in way more resources to empower these clubs to make better decisions. No, thank you. And to hire the sort of coaches to bring them to a baseline level. No, thank you. Which allows them to compete with the larger clubs. I think it's on our side that you create competitive balance. Even if it isn't, it's our side that creates the instrumental goal of increasing viewership. So all of this is to say that it's on our side we increase the total pool of money. We increase the likelihood that contracts and revenue sharing creates a larger pie that is shared amongst more teams. It is also on our side where you incentivize teams to run themselves well. Now, note, many teams in sport have had huge infusions of money. For instance, the New York Knicks, as they pointed out, these are fairly big markets. So thank you. For instance, Cardiff City as well. That's not the same as saying that all of these teams have used their funds correctly. I don't think it's an ironclad link that a team which gets more money uses that well. And I think it is important for us to continue to reward teams who make these decisions correctly. No, thank you. What does this look like? It means, for instance, being able to get investors to invest in the local neighborhood and developing the sorts of good players that they want to happen. It is in a world in which my financial security is tied to having a good academy to sell these players on, no, thank you, that I make it a bigger part of my business model if I'm a part of town that has lots of really good young players. So, I think on balance, it is also that it creates far more competitive balance, increases viewership, increases all the good things that they want in sport. Before I get to geographical spread, go ahead. Open it.
Yes. So you talk about getting investors and management styles, but given that investments are not profits and thus not part of this motion, doesn't it actually then incentivize teams, despite profit sharing, to have good management so they can get other forms of capital and services?
No, I'm just not sure why that's not part of this motion, right? Because presumably it's about wealthy teams, and there's lots of these like rich sheiks and investors invest money directly. In any case, often they use this money to create infrastructure which leads to profit in the future. So in the long run, that quickly gets us there anyway. All right. So I think on competitive balance we win that. Let's quickly deal with geographical spreads. I think the opening government has been quite vague on what they mean by geographical spread. I think Debi's argument here is the clearest one. She says there are multiple levels of association. Perhaps there is your region, there is your city, but it's also your country. And this government doesn't redistribute money between countries with huge established rich leagues and smaller leagues, like Portugal versus England. Why is it important that in the country of Portugal, you have one or two teams which fly the national flag, which are agglomerations of resources and perhaps create inequality in domestic Portuguese leagues, but at the very least have the resources to hold on to multiple star players and as a result can have a fighting chance at bigger European levels of competition? It is important because I can associate with my local hometown team, but I also associate with Porto, even if I'm not from this city, as the country, or as sort of a team that represents my national football, my national sport. This is far more likely to create the sorts of passion or inspiring young players to enter the sport and to love the sport that football leagues should care about. Because it's important to recognize there is no real trade-off here. You're still likely to identify with your local club, but crucially, with the agglomerated clubs we've talked about, you're also able to express this avenue on a far larger national level, when they're able to compete against the Galacticos and Real Madrids of the world. I, as an individual, far more likely to care about this sport, kick a ball around, join an academy, etc., etc. I think it's on our side of the house that you increase viewership where it really matters, i.e. everyone in the world, and number two is on our side, you get people meaningfully involved in the sport, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And now the member of government. Here.
Sorry. Yeah?
Yeah.
The way that the NFL draft happens has been statistically proven to be managed wrong. So teams focus on buying the one top player that they know will secure them brand contracts with big sponsors, and they don't buy 6 mediocre players who would actually help them win. We tell you that what money does in sport, like money in sport doesn't come just from people walking through the door and people buying the shirt. That's not the big bucks. The big bucks is the person who puts their name on the shirt. The Emirates who have their name on the roof of their stadiums. Like that's the money. And that money is the thing that manipulates not just the way that the teams do their strategy, but it manipulates the way they play the game. And we tell you that the thing that we want to solve in this debate is making people play games so that it's exciting. Because we tell you that if they want people to be involved in sport, if they want people to have such a big incentive to find new players, they have to change the way they play the game. They have to focus more on the mediocre than Bale. Because even if Bale and Ronaldo are at different clubs, people are still going to want to watch them. But we tell you that the people playing with Bale can be better and need to be bought better and invested in better, and that brands manipulate that process. But crucially, we think that I'm also going to talk to you about why people buy into sport firstly to prove that they still will, and then I'm going to talk to you about why people spend their money wrongly. But I think that it's important to note in this debate that the people have said a lot that there'll still be good players on either side of the house, and if the good players play together, then that's the important thing in this debate. We tell you that there are lots of people out there who, if you put enough time and effort into them, would be Bale or would be Ronaldo. I just think that if you put enough effort into people, if they spend enough hours kicking a football against a wall, then they'll get there.
you can spend money, you can find new ways of doing it. We tell you that the problem under the status quo is that Manchester United knows that if it wants Ronaldo, it can buy him. And it doesn't spend the money that it needs to on making sure that people in Manchester can properly play sport. We tell you that crucially in this motion, when you spread the money out, it means that all clubs have the same incentive. Like there will still, under your idea, there will still be lots of good coaches. They'll probably be paid less, and that's okay for us. But we think those coaches will be coaching even more people, which means that you do get more good players. So it isn't just about spreading Ronaldo around. But crucially, no thank you. And we think this is something that wasn't discussed a lot by our opening. It's the relationship between the sponsor, it's the relationship between the brand on the shirt and on the stadium and the team is more impactful than the relationship between the people who consume the product that the team gives them under the status quo. Because what sponsors do under the status quo is not only do they direct all of the tours that you tell us are so important in an outreach. Like the reason why Manchester United goes to China is because Emirates pays for them to go there under the status quo. So they influence all of that stuff, and we think that they still have an interest in doing that even when their money is spread out more broadly. We think it's likely that they'll sponsor Manchester United with less money, but also sponsor the smaller clubs if they think that money is going to be redistributed. But we also think that it means that they want particular people associated with that brand. So Emirates wants to buy Ronaldo, and if they sponsor Manchester United is then coerced to buy those big players because that's the name that their sponsor wants, and they know that if they don't have the big names on their card, even if they don't win, because often the teams, especially in football, that don't have the most money still don't win. It's all about that big name, and we tell you that relationship is uniquely manipulative. No, thank you. But in response to the op claim that people will stop watching in the absence of the Uber teams, in the absence of the Bale and Ronaldo in combination, I think it relies on a key assumption. Because what draws people to sport is the objective skill of the athletes, regardless of their relative level compared to other teams in the league. Bale wouldn't be so good if he wasn't playing alongside a load of other people who didn't look good to him in comparison. If there were more people who had more effort put into them and were also shooting goals like Bale, people would care less about him. The problem is the way that people allocate resources in sport and not the fact that there is only one Bale. And we think that this applies more broadly. So it's not just other teams in the league or other teams in the past. But crucially, we tell you, it's hard to, this relationship can be changed in a way that makes sport more exciting, that makes more people buy into it. We think that people aren't just loyal to their clubs because of the cultural, historic stuff that we have. It's in your family, you go to the games, you're used to going to the pub, it's fun, that's the UK version, you might go to a bar in the US. The kind of people that, your dad tells you like it, he buys you your first baseball glove or something. That's the way that it happens. But we think that it's actually something much more exciting than that. There's something about sport that's a discussion. You talk about it tactically, you listen to it on the radio, you watch talk shows where you think about structure, you think about the way that football teams are structured. And we tell you that is manipulated under the status quo by having Bale at the front. When you just don't have as many Bales at the front, you have to think more analytically about the way in which you play your game. And we think that wasn't fully explained by opening, despite the amount to which they are nodding during my speech. We think that this has to be innovative and exciting, and that will change a lot. No, thank you. Because we think at the point at which the teams realise that in order to win, in order to win the league, to be the best, they just can't buy it anymore. They can't buy themselves Bale. They have to innovate. They have to hire nerds who are going to talk about football strategy. They have to think about the way in which they can spend the limited amount of resources that they have to make themselves the team at the top so that they get the people walking through the door that you tell us is so important. Go.
In the status quo, the tactical discussion might be very diverse. Planning for a team with a Bale and Ronaldo, and planning for a team without them. Why is the world in which we plan for every team having one of these star players a better world, even if discourse were a good thing?
Firstly, I've told you that I think there will be more star players. But secondly, I also think that tactical discussion is important because it means that the game, I'm just about to get onto this, it means that the game changes more frequently. So in order to keep winning, you have to keep coming up with new innovative ideas. You can't keep winning by buying the new diamond. You have to win by changing the way that you get each and every diamond that you own to play. So under the status quo, rich teams buy rich players because of the name and the brand in the way I've explained. But we also think this interacts the way that poor teams follow. Poor teams can never get Emirates to sponsor their tour to China, so they will consistently lose. Because even if they innovate, they don't have that one star. We tell you that this levels the playing field to the point where all all teams have something they can innovate with. All teams have something that they can work with. And then sport becomes something that's fundamentally more about thinking. Something that's more exciting to watch, more exciting to be our participant in. You're not just standing in the crowds like yelling yids, which I would because I'm a Tottenham player, even though it's now been proved questionable. Like, you wouldn't just be standing yelling. The sport becomes more of a conversation. It becomes more of a discussion about something that you get to learn. We tell you at the point at which you use more economic analysis that's coming out of MIT and sport, it does just get more exciting. I've read some papers on it. It's pretty cool. You should too. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And now the member of the opposition. Here.
Mr. Speaker, so far in this debate, opening opposition has talked about lesser investment in the sport, which tangentially leads to fewer benefits for weaker teams. How we're going to extend this debate from closing opposition is by talking specifically about the direct harms that accrue while subsidizing unviable teams overall, which leads to a deterioration of the sport and prevents investment from reaching emerging teams that actually have the potential to be big. How are we going to do that? My rebuttals will largely be integrated, right? What we're going to analyze is this move actually good for the weak teams? Let's see what the cases have been so far. Opening government's case has largely been, in one line, good teams stay good and bad teams stay bad. We want to solve this. We have 3 questions to ask to them, which will also extend to closing government. A, why is creating this equity legitimate in the first place? No one has talked about this in detail so far. Opening opposition said there will be less money in the future, but what about past investments, right? People who have put in money in terms of branding, in terms of getting new management, in terms of getting stadiums, all of these investments which become instantaneously infructuous the moment you carry out this move. When you create this uncertainty, it also means it's less likely to result in investment in the future, which is something that opening opposition has already covered. But where does this investment come from in the first place, and to whom does it target? We tell you that it targets not the richest teams, not the most successful teams, but the upcoming mid-range teams. What are the teams we're talking about? We're talking about Leicester City, which for the first time won the British Premier League last year, even though it didn't have the money of Manchester United or Chelsea, even though it didn't have the huge star players like Ronaldo, right? We tell you that the big teams like Manchester United are already overcapitalized and they have enough investment. So the investment we're actually talking about in the future, which is likely to change, is not with respect to these big teams. They have enough money already. The money coming in is the money going to the weaker teams, which is what you're going to now start discouraging. Which brings me to the second question, right? Is this argument true that all good teams stay good, which are rich, and which are poor stay bad? We tell you no. The free market takes care of this in status quo. 4 simple examples to prove that point. Leicester City and the investment it started receiving, which I've already talked about. The fact that Manchester United is currently playing Europa instead of the UEFA Champions League. The fact that Red Sox won the Super Bowl after more than a century. And 4th, an example from cricket, which most people here may not be familiar about, the Rajasthan Royals, which were the weakest and poorest team in the Indian Premier League, which won it in its first year and have received significant funding from them since then, right? Why? Because there are existing methods for them to get money in status quo. Why? Because people love underdogs. When underdogs are talented but have fewer resources and they do well in spite of those resources and they show their talent, which we tell you there are enough avenues for them to do, they are rewarded. That's how the free market works, because in that scenario there is scope for growth there. Which is why closing government's extension is actually an argument that lies on our side. Because if their argument is, now you will hunt for newer diamonds instead of focusing on Ronaldo and Neil, we tell you that's already happening. That's the way status quo works. That's how you have newer players from Leicester City who become famous and do well after that, right? But thirdly, and finally, even if you, I'll let you in a bit. Okay, I'll let you know.
Would you tax somebody who makes £1 million a year more than somebody who makes 50? That's already
Sure,
happening.
but that's different from sports because there's no legitimacy first for the league in the first place to be taxing, which is something neither of the two houses have established. But B, even if you can tax them, if the purpose of the taxation is to redistribute in a way that is meaningful and beneficial for the poor, I am proving to you how that's not going to happen because it's going to be worse off. Finally, and this brings me perfectly to the point that responds to that question. Even if you want to create equity, is this the best way to create equity? Will this create the best form of equity? We say it won't for two reasons. First, there are very few rich and successful teams and a very large number of poor teams. The English Premier League is a perfect example of this. There are perhaps 5 or 6 teams you would consider rich and successful, whereas there are about 20 teams that would fall in the category of bad teams under side government, which means you're going to be distributing a very small chunk of money across a very large number of teams, some of whom are not performing well and therefore not viable businesses. That is in opposition to what we're saying, where all the investment goes to specific teams that are viable and have the capacity to use that money for good. B, throwing money at a failing business enterprise is not the solution. There are two types of investment, right? There are investments in non-performing assets, and there are investments in viable teams which have the capacity to perform but aren't performing for extraneous reasons right now. With respect to the second category, viable teams which are talented and have the capacity, we tell you they do get money in status quo, and that is what our entire extension has been. So they are supported, there is a likelihood of them succeeding. But with respect to the non-performing assets which do poorly, teams which don't have the capacity to do well in the future, we tell you that throwing money at them is not the solution for 3 reasons. First, they have insufficient fans, and fans are not fungible because fanhood is related to loyalty. So just because one team suddenly has lots of money, it doesn't create new fans. Manchester City is the best example of this. Despite receiving a lot of money in recent times, it hasn't suddenly accrued a lot of fans. B, poor management still make bad decisions. The reasons why these teams do badly often is simply because they don't have the best people in charge of them who don't know how to adequately price their tickets, they don't know how to sell assets, they don't know how to publicize themselves, all of which still continues, which means all the money you're spending is wasteful and not benefiting the players. 3, good players aren't suddenly going to start going to these teams simply because they have more money. Why? Because players care a lot more than just about how much money they're going to receive, because first of all, you haven't explained how these poorer teams which are getting subsidized will now be able to compete with the Chelseas and the Real Madrids to offer equal wages to get the best players. But even if you explain that, we tell you that Cristiano Ronaldo is not going to go to play for Nottingham City when Manchester United has greater reputation, a greater fan following, and is therefore going to be more beneficial for his career. Which means even the fungibility of players doesn't exist. Which is why everything you're saying on throwing money on these teams which aren't going to do well isn't going to make them better, and is only taking money away from teams that have the potential to do well. In my last 1 minute, I'm going to talk to you about alternatives that can be used to create the kind of equity they want that don't necessarily run this risk. 2 simple alternatives. 1, put spending limits on players in trades. Why does this work? It means that the benefit that you want of clubs not being able to buy out the best players accrues to you, but at the same time it doesn't steal away the profits and therefore doesn't disincentivize investment in the same way. Second alternative, mandatory reservations for different categories of players for limited years. Again, an example from the Indian Premier League, where under 21 players are mandated to get a reservation in the best teams, where they are trained with the best resources and the best coaches, and then they go to different teams to play for everyone equally, which again creates better equity without messing with the incentives for investment. All of which means, A, they haven't proven why their move is legitimate, B, why it's actually effective, and C, why it's the best alternative we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And now the government whip to close the case for the government.
Thank you. The reason why we like an underdog and why we like it when an unexpected team wins a league is because we never could have guessed when that season started that that was the outcome.
That's what Kez tells you in her speech, Changes in Sport. When all teams are at a more equal playing field, we don't know at the start of that league who the favorite is. We don't know which coach is going to be able to work with that equal set of players. It's that excitement that means that we like the underdog. It isn't the fact that that underdog is an outlier. That excitement is much more likely to happen under our side and doesn't rely on the luck of Leicester getting James Vardy, which is something that you can't depend on, which is something that only happens once in a blue moon, and which is something that I think leaves most teams that don't have a lot of money disadvantaged, because people ask them, well, why haven't you pulled the Leicester yet? As opposed to, why are you structurally unable to compete with teams that have more money than you? I think that that's why we are able to get better sport, and I think that that's why we are able to win this debate. Two things in this speech that I'm going to answer. First, why do people buy into sport in the first place? Second, how does this change sport to a way that means that people buy into that particular sport? But I want to answer one question first, just a little bit extraneously. So we hear this question out of the beginning of the extension, wait, is this actually even legitimate? And the answer is held in the POI that I asked when he said, look, we think that tax is justified because it helps the vast majority of poor people. Good. We are going to prove to you that this helps the vast majority of poor teams. So it's not enough for them to help Leicester. They need to help all of the other poor teams as well. So by their very own metric, I think them relying on one per league team winning that is poor is something that they've lost already, if that's principally what they stand for. So, with that in mind, let's get into the ideas of why people buy into sports in the first place. We hear from the beginning of Team Opposition that people buy into sports when they see uber teams. So when they see all of the best players in the league on one team and are able to say, look at how amazing those individuals are. We later hear people actually love underdogs when they don't know if that team is good and are really excited to see what those players do. I'm going to assume that both of those things can exist at the same time, although I'm not entirely sure that those things do go together. So dealing with the first one, in terms of people really loving when there is an uber team, Kez tells you in her extension that it's really difficult for me to say this team this year compared to all of the teams in the past, what is their relative level, especially because they're competing in a different league against different people. So I think that that's something that people actually care substantially less about. But even if that is something that we care about, Kez also tells you in her extension that we are still likely to get a lot of good players. There are just going to be more of them, more spread out. How did that work, and how did she explain that to you? When all teams have money, but each team has less money, the ability of one team to pay an exorbitant wage to a coach decreases, but it doesn't mean that those coaches disappear. It just means that those coaches are more able to be spread out. So you have more coaching talent spreading out to more of the teams. So you do have teams with really, really good players. It's just more than one. And so I think, no thanks, if they do want teams that are relatively more skilled at sport, and if that's what makes people like sport, Kez tells you how it's really important. But secondly, if people do love underdogs, let's look at why that happens. Because I think when an individual sees a team that is an underdog, the reason why they like it is because that proves to them that there is some element of the game that is decided by the strategy of that particular team. That is decided by how well you train and how well you strategize your players to work together. That's why a huge amount of people who didn't previously like football, like myself, started following when I was like, oh my god, Leicester might actually have a chance of doing something this time. But it's not because there were a bunch of good teams and there was Leicester. It was because finally it was proven that this is actually a game that can be won by strategy. It was proven that this is actually a game that can be won by people who are doing interesting things with the sport. It's because they found a new way of doing things, and they are going to find more new ways of doing things, the point to which you can't rely on buying those big players who are going to kick the thing and do the thing and get more money for you. I think that when you don't rely on that anymore, you're much likely to get that variance. You're much more likely to get teams that change their strategy year to year because they have to, because they don't have the competitive advantage of having that uber team. So I think if it is about underdogs, the reason why underdogs are popular actually plays into our side back half.
On legitimacy, you already get these teams to pay income tax to subsidize the poor. What you're asking for is a tax that in addition subsidizes their competitors. Do you ask Toyota to subsidize Honda, Ford, and Fiat? Why is that legitimate?
Okay, so yes, I'm asking them to subsidize their competitors. I don't think that those are examples of car companies that are significantly poorer than the others. I think that most of those are successful car companies. I think if it was effective to get us better cars, I'd do it, because I think that's probably good for people, especially those who are poor. Yeah, okay. In terms of what we told you, I think I've largely spoken about that, but Kez tells you people are interested in sport when it changes and when it's exciting, and when people who like the Toronto Maple Leafs like me can't just be told all the time you're going to lose, and they know that it's true. When people are able to exist in a situation where they can't guess what's going to happen, they're going to watch it more because there's more difference in terms of what they're watching. In terms of how this changes sport, I think that this is heavily reliant on the idea that they tell you in back half that sponsorship doesn't actually go to big teams, it goes to up-and-comers, which is in direct tension with something that we heard from opening half, which is actually it's all the money going to the big teams, that's why they're such uber teams. So again, those two things don't really exist together, but I think that we've dealt with them both. So, when Kez tells you that we change the strategy that teams have to look at in sport, I think this is true, because it's likely that Emirates is still going to want their name on popular sports stadiums and on the backs of t-shirts, simply because a lot of people do like sport and will like sport under either side of the house. So, given that these sponsors are still going to exist, and we spread their wealth around, I think that it's actually much more likely that we are able to use these sponsors in a way that improves the game overall. And let me remind you that when that happens, smaller teams are also likely to get a lot of their own funding as well. Maybe to the point where there isn't that disparity anymore and we don't have to do this. Maybe to the point where there's the development that these teams are able to compete. But they tell you the problem is poor management, and the problem is actually reputation. That's just non-comparative. Teams with poor management aren't going to do well under either side, but if it's good management that just can't afford a good coach, give them the money to do that. If it's good management that can't set that team up for success, give them the money to prove themselves. I think that if we improve the ability for teams to have a good reputation, for them being able to say, I have enough money to actually make you good, that's when you get the highest chance of spreading this. Because we get a more exciting game, a more equal game, and a game that many more people are willing to watch. I am incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And now the opposition whip to close out the case for the opposition bench, and regrettably, the debate is on.
May I begin? Mr. Speaker, sports teams don't exist in black and white. SIDE government would have you believe that there are a handful of heavily overcapitalized teams and all the others are underfunded underdogs brimming with potential who have just been shut out because they're based out of cities that aren't urban metropolises. From side closing opposition, we have been the only team to tell you that the free market is far more effective at singling out and directing investment toward teams that can actually do something with it. We don't think that occurs under side government's model when you disincentivize investors by grabbing their profits and then spreading them so thinly across all the other teams that no one team has enough capital to do anything with it. We think there's one question you need to answer to be able to decide this debate. Where are we going to be able to find the money to fund teams that have potential but are currently underfunded? From side government, we've heard that we need to increase competitiveness in sport because things like ticket sales and TV contracts are where these leagues get their money. But they assume that there will continue to be huge amounts of money to redistribute among these teams without accounting for the fact that there's now huge disincentive to investors. Because their one incentive for investing in these teams are the massive profit turnovers that they see. We drew analogies with private equity funds that often invest in lower performing assets only because they know they'll be able to improve their value exponentially and then sell them at that massive surplus. They continue to tell you from side closing government that investors are still going to stay. There are still incentives because they want their name on the stadium and they want to be associated with Ronaldo. But we tell you that the value to that stadium and that value to Ronaldo's brand comes from you being able to invest in them repeatedly, to make them that fantastic, to build their brand value, to make him the quality player he is, to make that stadium as big and shiny as it can be. That can only happen when you're allowed to reinvest your profits rather than have them be grabbed every time you do make that bigger surplus to be able to build those sorts of brands or those sorts of stadiums. We also hear from side opening government that, well, TV contracts and ads are important, people want to watch these sports, and so we need to have a lot of competitiveness. While side opening opposition only told you that, well, you just need a couple of excellent teams to get people to watch. We told you, agreeing with side government, that you do need underdogs. But you need underdogs who have a chance to create that romantic story of rags to riches by honing their talent, by being excellent, and by attracting that investment. We tell you, you take that away when you compulsively redistribute profits without any regard for skill or merit. And we tell you, in status quo, being a part of this larger league, whether it's a cricket league or a football league or a basketball league, allows you a degree of visibility to these potential investors. We tell you, because you're regularly going to be playing matches that are screened on primetime television, because you'll often be playing matches against these big fancy teams that currently have all of the fan following, you do get a lot of visibility. Whether it's just an individual team, whether it's just an individual player on that team, people recognize that talent, people have that, and so these underdog teams and these underdog players do have a degree of visibility that's necessary to attract that investment and to enable them to improve. They also tell you that this redistributed money is simply going to be enough, right? You just take a little bit of the surplus that the big teams currently have and you hand it over to everyone else, and that's going to be enough for them to suddenly just blossom and become excellent. But we think it's a bit of a contradiction when we hear from side opening government the kind of things that these excellent teams do, like buying out massive stadiums and spending millions of dollars on top players. Because when they admit that they aren't trying to radically redistribute profits, we're wondering where they're getting the money from now for these terrible teams and terrible players to suddenly have the funds to become that good. We tell you there's necessarily a trade-off when you decide to shift from private investment that can give you a massive capital influx to underfunded teams that have great potential, to instead redistributing profits, which necessarily means they're redistributed more thinly. Each team gets lesser profits and is therefore necessarily less able to do things with it. So we tell you this massive capital injection, which by their admission is necessary to make a team great, can only come from external investors, not from internal redistribution. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Yeah, so you talk about all of these investors that are going to not come to these teams simply because there is a relative medium of profits they are all making. And then you talk about how management as well as players make such a difference. Doesn't it then stand to reason that if you have equal profits but still have a comparative difference in managerial style and players, that there's still going to be a difference in investment and an incentive to do well?
No, because we told you that simply throwing money at a team isn't enough to make it better. And that's where our distinction, which we are the only team to have brought out, becomes important. Because there are some teams that simply don't have the potential to become the sort of superstars you expect them to, no matter how much money you throw at them. Because there are things that go into a business to making it profitable, to making it have that amazing brand value beyond just how much capital they have to work with. And that's why we spoke to you about having terrible managers which are managing these teams in the first place, about maybe having a lot less raw skill and talent to work with, which no matter how much more training or coaching or money you give them, will not be able to meet the expectations or meet the skill levels of the most excellent teams. So in that situation, we think they haven't accounted for the fact that beyond money, there are a lot of different factors that go into deciding whether or not a team does in fact become excellent in the long run. So we tell you, because they have simply assumed that there is going to be all of this money to redistribute, and even if there is, that simply throwing money at all teams will make them all competitive, that's necessarily a paradoxical situation. Because you cannot have every team being equally competitive. You cannot have a continuous process of redistribution where every single time a team drops out or begins underperforming and thus attracts less investment, you're going to keep propping them up. That doesn't make for good television, because you're not linking teams' success or the amount of funding or their ability to attract fans or investment to the amount of skill or merit or potential in that team. The kind of stories of underdogs that people like to follow on TV, that people do become ardent and devoted fans
to particular clubs or particular teams for so many years is because they know that they believe in the skill of that team. They believe that it is the skill of that team that will be able to attract that investment, to allow them to grow and to allow them to become as big as they have the potential to be. The moment you start redistributing wealth on the mere basis of whether or not you have enough to begin with, you take away from that magical story of the underdog performing so well in the long run. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for a tremendous debate. If you could go outside, shake hands in that order, we'll call you back in when we come to a decision. If you could turn the lights